Guys, try to follow along, okay? It's called logic.
And so none of them owned up to the mass murders, the destruction, the creation of massive poverty, and so forth. And one of the ironic things and that drives me crazy that I write about in this book is that a lot of these same people who spent their careers on the side of these horrible criminals who ran these socialist countries still to this day pretend to occupy the moral high ground at the American universities, and their students, and their intellectual descendants do the same thing. They always occupy the moral high ground, even though their ideology is associated with the worst crimes in human history.
Hell yeah! Hell yeah!
Hey, welcome back, Truth Seekers. I'm here with a very special guest today. His name is Thomas J. DiLorenzo. He wrote a book called The Problem with Socialism, which I highly recommend you go and purchase right away. It's a quintessential guide to knowing why people who like socialism have some mental issues. I'm not allowed to say the R word anymore, but really, they're a problem in society. Are they not, Dr. Lorenzo?
The socialists.
Yes, sir.
To be sure, yeah. The motivation for the book was that the younger generation, there were opinion polls saying such things as 69% of voters under 30 said they could vote for a socialist for president. And to someone my age, I've been a college professor, an economics professor for 35 years. It's kind of shocking because of a complete absence of any really fundamental economic understanding, as well as history, the whole history of socialism in the world. And so that was the motivation behind the book.
Is the kind of the last barrier between them and actual society. Do you feel any sense of failure when people come into your class and they're pro-socialist, they're Bernie bros and babes? I mean, how personally do you take that?
Well, a couple of years ago, I would have, students would come into my classes wearing Bernie Sanders T-shirts because they were infatuated with the idea of free stuff, free education, free healthcare, and so forth. And, when I would teach them about the economic principle of opportunity cost, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And I would point out that I don't work for free, and neither does anyone else at the university. So how could education be free? Or their doctor, does your doctor work for free? Or the nurse that works with the doctor? And they quickly catch on. And then I usually show them I put on a screen in the classroom the debt clock. If you were to Google debt clock, you'll see this video of this clock in Times Square, New York City. It moves at about 10,000 miles an hour, adding dollar after dollar to the national debt. And my students pretty quickly understand that it's on them, that they're going to be paying taxes for the rest of their lives for this debt. And and even though they might be sophomores or juniors, they're starting to count their take-home pay because they're going to enter the workforce pretty soon. And so my experience is that it doesn't take that long to turn a lot of the students around with a little bit of education.
So I want to get into some more of your reasons for writing the book, but I just want to throw out a question that I love to ask someone who's in your position, which is, what's something that everyone believes that you know is a lie?
Something that everyone believes
that everyone kind of takes for granted that's probably true, but is in fact a lie.
Well, about socialism in particular is that it leads to equality. When the reality is that the socialist societies in history have been grossly unequal, and I would argue much more unequal than capitalism. And also there's a corollary to that capitalism is the great equalizer. If you're poor, you need a job and you need to start a business. That's how you become unpoor. And that's probably the biggest falsehood that I can think of with regard to capitalism and socialism.
Are you counting community organizing as a job? Just need to make sure I understand.
Community organizing. Well, if it's paid for voluntarily, it's a job. If it's based on tax dollars, then it's just a government boondoggle.
So I noticed here that you're a senior fellow at the von Mises Institute, and you've got a long list of accolades. It says one of your influences on Wikipedia is John T. Flynn. I actually just read one of his books for the first time this year. Tell the audience who he is and why he's important.
Yeah, there are a lot of great writers that were considered to be part of the old right. They wrote in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and John T. Flynn was one of them. And Flynn wrote a great book called The Roosevelt Myth, and he was one of the big, powerful critics of FDR during the New Deal. He pointed out how the New Deal was, in many ways, very similar to fascism. and from an economic perspective, not with the anti-Semitism and all that stuff, but from an economic perspective. And he was a great writer and a very strong-willed person. He had to be, because he was a sort of a tiny minority. And so I would encourage conservative students to learn a little bit about the old right, including John T. Flynn.
And so that was the book that I read, was The Roosevelt Myth. And I was under the impression that he was actually very pro-Roosevelt until Roosevelt started kind of changing the climate on him. And he said, wait a minute, this is not a good thing for us, this road to go down. And it reminds me a lot of things we see today. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, Roosevelt, criticized Herbert Hoover for being such a big spender, and he promised to balance the budget. So, like a lot of politicians, if you look at what he said when he was running for the first time, a lot of it sounded pretty conservative. And so, but then, of course, as soon as he gets into office, he does exactly the opposite of what he said he was planning on doing with regard to balancing the budget. And I suspect that's what might have fooled John T. Flynn temporarily, anyway.
And he was attacked mercilessly, viciously, right? Even from Roosevelt after he kind of flipped on him.
Oh yes, the FDR created a whole government committee that would promote the New Deal and criticize or harass all of its critics. It was very totalitarian oriented, and John T. Flynn was definitely on the government's hit list, so to speak. Not the mafia style hit list, but a list of people who they wanted to discredit, and he was pretty effective at it.
So going through the book, which was fantastic, by the way, I appreciate your efforts, and it looks like on Amazon it's doing pretty well. Is it sell consistently, or did it trail off? I'm just curious, as someone who likes to know.
It's still selling pretty well. I'll get the latest sales figures in a couple of weeks, but the reviews are all, I think 85% of the reviews are 5-star reviews, and I still have a very good sales ranking for a book that's been out a whole year on Amazon. So. It is selling.
That's great. So I want to tackle some of the most common myths that you destroy in your book so that people will be enticed to go out and get it. One that definitely stands out is you talk about how Russians were called international socialists, Germans were national socialists, Bernie bros are democratic socialists. At what point can we stop pretending that there's a huge difference? Every time I run into a 35-year-old millennial, they explain to me that they really don't have that much in common, and one's better than the other. We act like if there's a huge ideological gap. Couldn't it be that socialism is the reason these people all did bad things and didn't get along?
Yeah, it is. It's all collectivism. Fascism is a form of socialism. One of my chapters is called The Socialist Roots of Fascism. I quote extensively Friedrich Hayek's famous book, The Road to Serfdom. He was a Nobel Prize-winning economist who taught at the University of Chicago for many years. And he said all the originators of fascism were socialists. And of course, the word Nazi stood for National Socialism. And the German socialists just called themselves National Socialists, whereas their counterparts in Russia called themselves International Socialists. And I get people sometimes to tell me, oh, yes, they were evil. They mass murdered tens of millions of their own people, as the Russians did, and the Chinese, and all the rest of them. But that was communism, not socialism. But, the Soviet Union, they called their own government the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They did not call it the Union of Soviet Communist Republics. Communism was this utopian ideal that they thought they might achieve in 100 years. But in the meantime, they were all socialists. And so the things that I write about in the book apply to the whole gang: fascist, socialist, democratic socialist. I make the point is sort of an oxymoron, because socialism always eventually destroys democracy, as we see today in Venezuela.
Yeah, you make a really good case that basically socialism lives and breathes on a foundation of lies. And it's interesting to me as you'd explain that. Why has the pernicious part of that lie been able to exist for so long? Why is it young people and old are drawn to this idea that socialism, there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? What is the small facet in there that keeps this lie alive? Like, what's its beating heart? I'm very curious about this.
Well, I quote one of the books I quote in quite a few places in my book is a book called Socialism by Ludwig von Mises. That's Mises. And in one of the things Mises writes in his book, is that, and his famous treatise called Human Action, is that statists or interventionists, the advocates of big government, socialists, have always been at war with economics, because even the most fundamental basic economic principles can open your eyes to what a foolish idea socialism is. And so what we have, I've been a professor for over 35 years, so what I've seen is progressively less and less teaching of basic economics in the schools, and more propaganda about big government, socialism, and so forth. And so many young people today come out of high school knowing very little, if anything at all, about supply and demand, markets, capitalism, but they've been very well indoctrinated in socialism and sort of pie in the sky socialism. Wouldn't it be nice if everything was free? When of course nothing is free. And so you got the combination of a very poor economic education and being bombarded for 12 years or longer with propaganda, socialist propaganda, and that persuades a lot of people.
And you mentioned in the book, it was a big part of the Russian and the German systems is to have not only schooling that was mandated by the state, but also the Politburo had organizations that were in charge of making sure that, I forget how you worded it in your book, but basically today would be fake news or debunked truths couldn't be spread amongst the people. I forget the term you used, but I thought that was fascinating because we see that today.
Yeah, exactly. And some things never change. Our society in America has been at least half socialist for a very long time. If you look at total tax revenues taken by all levels of government and divided by national income, in some years it's close to 40%. And that doesn't include the effects of government regulation, where the government has de facto control of a lot of businesses and a lot of aspects of our lives. So we're at least half socialist now. And like I kind of repeat myself, I guess, in that, in a book that I published way back in 1992 with a co-author, it's called Official Lies, How Washington Misleads Us, about how socialism of all its forms is based on a big bundle of lies. And it's the big lie strategy. If you repeat the big lie enough times, you'll get a lot of people to believe it. Not everybody, but you'll get a lot of people to believe it.
It's a personal point of contention for me. My oldest is 7 and starting school, last week, I guess. But we have family in California still. They haven't escaped yet. And their kids came home the first day of school from 6th and 8th grade. And, you do the whole, hey, what did you learn? How'd your day go? And both of them said, well, we learned that transgenders can pick their gender based on, how they feel at the time. First day of school. And then they have a manual they give out to the kids, which is not online. It's one of the only documents the parents can access. They actually have to go, because my aunt called the school. You have to go down to the school and set an appointment with someone to review the sexual files that they give the children. I thought, this sounds a lot like what I read in your book about the way they regimented schooling back then.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's government takeover of the schools was in the 25-point platform of the Nazi Party, which you can read online. Just type in 25-point program of Nazi Party. It's also in the Communist Manifesto, the famous 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. So socialists and fascists, whatever you want to call them, have always understood that they have to brainwash the children, the youth of America. And that's why conservatives have always been critics of government schooling in general and advocates of as much competition and choice and privatization of schooling as possible. Homeschooling, of course, is very popular among a lot of conservatives. And I think every parent has to be, if they want to be responsible, has to be at least partly a homeschool parent. You can send your kids to a school, but you also have to keep an eye on what they learn in school. And this is in line with something I read about in the book called Destructionism. I quoted Ludwig von Mises as saying socialism always involved what he called destructionism, that is, attempt to destroy the existing institutions of society in order to start fresh and have your socialist utopia. And of course, what is in the minds of children has to be changed first and foremost in order to achieve that. And I think that's one of the reasons why the socialists of the world have always zeroed in on education first and foremost, even the first day of school, like you said.
Absolutely. It's funny. I Googled the 25-point Nazi plan. I found it on Debbie Wasserman Schultz DNC homepage, but it was called The Better Deal. So I wasn't sure that was the same thing. Apparently it is. So question, I think about the stigmas, like you see what's going on lately with Antifa at, you've got Berkeley, you've got Charlottesville. As I read through it, I thought, shouldn't we really be calling it anti-so and not Antifa? I mean, they make this distinction, but what I'd really like to see is a stigma. We should treat them, I mean, I have this opinion that it's basically beta males that are drawn to this. There was a survey that came out a couple weeks ago that was pretty funny that tried to make that claim. But why don't we stigmatize them the way we do Westboro Baptists or smokers instead of the way we treat radical ideologues or jihadists, and we say, well, it's society's fault and they're the downtrodden and the oppressed minority, and that's why they lash out and that's why they are this way.
Well, I've been recently calling these people social justice Bolsheviks and trying to associate them with the Russian Bolsheviks, because that's really basically what they're doing. They're behaving like violent communist radicals, and that's so. I think we should call them what they are, and leave it at that. And I don't know if that's going to stick, but I've been doing it on I blog on LouRockwell.com. In the last couple of days, I decided to start calling these people social justice Bolsheviks. I used to call them social justice cupcakes.
I like it. There's got to be some stigma to it, right? Where, like, I used to think when they would show people, remember when the guy shot the reporter, the black guy that was unhappy at work and thought everyone was racist, and he walked up to her in the morning and shot her? Or you have a Virginia Tech shooting. They show these people, they talk about their lives, they do their names. I'm like, why are we dignifying any of this? We should call them what they are. These are domestic terrorist losers, and make sure anyone knows if they do that, they're going to be branded. I hope that doesn't make me Antifa for saying it, but I just hate that there's not the proper amount of outrage and disgust at these people's behavior. Especially in lieu of the fact that we know the Bolshevik story. We know what they were into. We know what Marx said about using politics, not just to defeat your enemy, but to wipe them off the face of the earth.
Yeah, I think Ann Coulter in one of her recent columns mentioned that we can't even criticize these people, let alone prosecute them for the crimes they commit, like at Berkeley and places like that, because that is she's addressing the media, the so-called mainstream media, that get all up in arms if you even criticize these people, because they become the new saints. It's really like 2 years ago the transgendered were the chief mascots of the left, but now I think the left is making as their chief mascots these violent criminals who go around beating people with clubs who they disagree with, and setting buildings and cars on fire. Yeah,
the transgenders are not going to react well to be treating like the old NFL running back who's now looking for a spot on the team. It's going to get ugly. Yeah. But they learn the hard way. Now, I got a friend I was arguing with the other day, and they use this common parlance of, we have a social compact. And when there was the debate about gay marriage, I would hear, well, public businesses serve the public good. They're in the public sphere, and they have to serve the public need. And as I'm reading your book, and you quote people like Fausto Pitigliani and some of the other Italian fascists, I realized this language they use came from the fascists of the early 20th century and the late 19th century. And I wasn't even really aware of that. And it actually makes me mad I didn't take that opportunity to say, where did you learn to talk like this? Whose language are you using? So you make some really good examples. Can you elaborate on it a little bit?
Well, yeah, in my chapter on the socialist roots of fascism, I quote Mussolini himself and the Nazis as, before they had their political success, they understood that they had to be destructionists, as Ludwig von Mises said. And what did they have to destroy? They had to destroy the ideas of liberalism. Now, in Europe at the time, liberalism meant was closer to libertarianism. It meant free markets, free enterprise, the rule of law, equality under the law, the things that had evolved over the centuries as a part of Western civilization. That was liberalism. And so I quote Mussolini himself as saying that stands for the individual. The basis of liberalism is respect for the individual human being as an individual human being. And then he says, but fascism is respect for the state. The state is preeminent over everything. And so a lot of people won't go along with that. So you have to disguise it with language. You have to call it the public interest or the common good or something like that. You can't just say the bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy doesn't have a good reputation.
No.
And so it's a rhetorical trick that Mussolini used, the Nazis used, the Russian communists, the Russian socialists used, and it's used today. And your friend who you spoke to probably has no idea of the genesis of that. But the genesis is actually Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher, who was sort of the founding philosopher of communism, who first came up with this idea that there exists something called the common good that was only supposedly known in the minds of a select few, and they had a right supposedly to impose that on the rest of society, and if not, off with your head. And we seem to be getting closer to that direction now, don't we, with these violent criminal thugs showing up at whenever there's an Ann Coulter speech on a college campus, or a Charles Murray or someone like that.
Or Ben Shapiro, and it's funny because Jean-Jacques Rousseau was such a wonderful guy, just a splendid member of society, someone I'd love to get to know better. I was reading some biography work on him, and like a lot of other people who share his ideas, which is why I think the stigma should be there, bad guy, like not a good person at all. So can we detach his ideas from the fact that he didn't actually live that way, that he was kind of a deplorable human being?
Yeah, there's an interesting thesis. There's a book by Paul Johnson, the historian, called Intellectuals. And he has chapter after chapter about famous leftist intellectuals, Karl Marx being the preeminent. And a very interesting chapter on what a miserable human being Karl Marx was. He had a maid who worked in his home. He impregnated her. She had a baby. He did not support the baby. He didn't pay her anything. Karl Marx. And so he treated her like a slave, essentially. And he gave her food and clothing and shelter, and that's it. And so, there might be something to it. So if you want to follow up on that, I would recommend this book, Intellectuals, by Paul Johnson.
Yeah, I think he, who else is, it's Rousseau, it's Marx. I think he rips on Hemingway has quite a delightful chapter in that book. I can't recall who else, but yeah, I definitely recommend that one. So one thing I wasn't really cognizant of when I read it, I'm trying to think what I learned that I wasn't expecting to learn. And you made the comment that Marx and Hitler and the other people who believed in this ideology, they necessarily had to destroy lower levels of government. And that's something that the light went off for me immediately. They had no interest in letting local and state level governments operate sovereignly from the national agenda.
Well, sure. That's always been the main objective of all socialists of all varieties, is the elimination of federalism. Federalism is a uniquely American idea. Some of the parts of it came from Europe. The Europe of centuries ago was very highly decentralized with the city-states. So if you lived in a city-state where the government was tyrannical, it was very easy to vote with your feet and move to a nearby city-state. And that's where the idea of American federalism came from. And so in the book, I actually, of all people, I quote Adolf Hitler himself from Mein Kampf. Most people are probably wondering, what am I doing sitting around reading Mein Kampf? But I took a course in European history 100 years ago when I was a college student, and I remember having to read part of this because it was part of European history. And there was a whole chapter in Mein Kampf about federalism and states' rights, where Adolf Hitler himself actually approvingly quotes Abraham Lincoln, of all people, as being an opponent of states' rights. And so even Hitler wanted to use the mantle of Lincoln to make his case for abolishing federalism in Germany. He thought he wanted all power to be at the center, which, of course, with him in charge. And it was the same with the Soviets. And it's the same in our world today in the United States. The interventionists, the statists, the socialists, whatever you want to call them, all want power centralized in Washington, D.C., and then they want to grab onto it. And that's the thinking. Even a lot of conservatives fall into this trap of thinking that's our only alternative. And I call it thinking horizontally. We think that left and right, and if only we can capture the government, we can put our people in. But there's a long history of freedom advocates thinking vertically in terms of the devolution of power away from Washington. And, it goes way back long before Lord Acton, the great British historian of liberty, as far as that goes.
Yeah, I think you just hit the nail on the head in terms of why I tell people that I identified as reluctant Trump during the election, because so much of it was about just beating the left and tilting the seesaw back in that direction, Whereas I feel like we have to be aspiring to something a little more important than that in terms of it's not just about winning, it's about making sure the government's structured the way the founders envisioned. How did you identify during the election? And have you evolved since then?
Oh, I'm never optimistic about any politician doing very good works for us. But I was certainly in favor of Trump over Hillary Clinton, and I did not want a criminal enterprise back in the White House that we had been observing for so many years. And so that doesn't mean I approve of everything Donald Trump was saying or doing. But I hardly thought that he could be worse than Hillary Clinton. Yeah,
and I should clarify that it was reluctant Trump, and then way over here out of view is cyanide pills, which is how I felt about Hillary.
Well, I wrote a blurb for Phyllis Schlafly's last book that she wrote. She was very pro-Trump, and Rhetoric Publishing published it right just before the election, and one of the blurbs in the back cover is from me. And she was very high on Trump as saving us from the scourge of 8 more years of the Obama administration, basically. And I think the progressives knew that they already had their 8 years. If they had 8 more, we'd be pretty much a totalitarian progressive society with 8 more years of the same thing. And I always thought that Hillary Clinton was much more of a Bolshevik than Obama was.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Congrats on the blurb in Schlafly's book. I didn't realize that. It's great. I didn't read that one. Did you actually get it and read it? Was it a good book?
Oh yeah, Rhetoric Publishing sent it to me online just as it was, before it was actually out. And it was very well done, very well argued. She has a co-author, of course, because she was elderly and ill at the time. But she, up to her dying day, she was a fighter. She was fighting for her country, basically, and it's what a remarkable woman she must have been. I never met her, but that was quite remarkable, and it was an honor for me to be able to contribute a blurb to a book like that.
Yeah, she was a remarkable woman. Third wave feminists don't like her so much, so I know she did something right in her life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, so you tackle 2 of the biggest myths that are out there, and I love destroying these ones. Sweden and Denmark, a place where socialism actually works. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, Sweden, I quote the Swedish Academy of Economics and a number of Swedish economists. And the story about Sweden, which Bernie Sanders held up as a role model for America, as well as Hillary Clinton during the election cycle. The story there is Sweden in the late 19th and early 20th century was a very limited government, low tax society, very entrepreneurial. It produced great entrepreneurs like Alfred Nobel, the inventor of dynamite, and the people who invented Saab and Volvo automobiles and everything that goes along with it. And so they created a great amount of wealth. It was one of the wealthiest countries in the world in the early 20th century. And then they did what England did after World War II and adopted their version of socialism by nationalizing a lot of their bigger industries, heavy taxation, progressive taxation, a big welfare state. And according to the Swedish Academy of Economics, they did not create a single net new job for the next 55 years, beginning in 1955. So they essentially destroyed their economy and lived off the fat that had been created by the earlier generations of Swedish capitalists. And the Swedes had to retrench in the 90s. They cut some taxes, they privatized some industries, including parts of healthcare. And so they made a bit of a comeback, although it's still much bigger government even than ours. But I can remember in the early to mid 80s, meeting a Swedish novelist who had come to America because she was a very successful novelist in Sweden. And the tax system in Sweden was such that she had to pay 110% taxes on her latest novel. So she made $10,000. She owed more than $10,000 in taxes on the profits from her novel. So naturally, she came to America. She must have been reading about the Reagan tax cuts back there in Sweden, so she came here.
Yeah, and that reminds me, I'd only learned about a year ago that the founder of IKEA was forced to leave, essentially, because he couldn't hack it over there with their tax system. He's recently come back, I believe, to enjoy the twilight of his life, and the company's being run by his sons. But when they talk about Sweden, the thing that we all associate with it are meatballs and IKEA, he left. He didn't like it there. And you talk about the GDP, I think over a period of less than 20 years, their GDP, their debt was 50%, and then it actually went up to 80% in the next 3 years after that. I mean, I didn't know that. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, that's sort of typical of the socialist societies that destroy themselves. We see that in the most extreme example today is Venezuela. I also mentioned Argentina in the first chapter of the book, that under Juan Perón, they adopted their version of socialism and pretty much destroyed their economy. And then they tried to bail themselves out for the next several decades by printing money. And they ended up with something like 12,000% inflation in the 1980s, and the whole system collapsed. And Venezuela is doing the same thing today. Sweden had their version of trying to bail out their system. And one of the lessons there is that socialist politicians rarely, if ever, give up on their plans to restructure society. And so once their plans fail, as they inevitably do for the reasons I discuss in the book, what they do is they typically give themselves more power, and that means less democracy and less freedom. And you see that in spades in Venezuela today, where they actually have disbanded the national legislature and put in its place a sort of a kangaroo legislature made up of socialist political hacks, and they've abolished civil liberties. They're talking about forcing people to work in the farms for 2 months out of the year just to feed the people of the country, like in the old Soviet Union. And that's how socialism eventually is very corrupting of democracy, because socialist politicians will never, ever admit that they were wrong. Instead, they'll give themselves more powers to do more damage to their own countries until some sort of implosion occurs, as it eventually did in the Soviet Union, but it took a long time, didn't it?
Yeah. And I was talking to another gentleman about this. I said, it's too bad that we can't make, when people like, I wouldn't say Dennis Rodman because he's unserious, but take Sean Penn, for instance, who went out there and talked about how great Hugo Chavez was, Noam Chomsky. Within 5 years, they should have to come back and do a Braveheart, where we basically force them to confess, or we cut them open in front of everyone. I mean, that's a little morbid, but maybe the first part for sure. Have them admit, I was wrong. This is a terrible idea. I'm sorry. I'll never do it again.
Yeah, they never do that, do they? After the collapse of communism in the late 80s, early 90s, there were a few socialists in America who didn't really apologize, but admitted they were wrong. Robert Heilbronner was one of them. He wrote an essay in the New Yorker, I think it was in October of 1991, around there. And the title was Mises Was Right. Ludwig von Mises, the great critic of socialism in the 20th century, but he was one of the few. And so none of them owned up to the mass murders, the destruction, the creation of massive poverty, and so forth. And one of the ironic things, and that drives me crazy, that I write about in this book, is that a lot of these same people who spent their careers on the side of these horrible criminals who ran these socialist countries still to this day pretend to occupy the moral high ground at the American universities, and their students, and their intellectual descendants do the same thing. They always occupy the moral high ground, even though their ideology is associated with the worst crimes in human history.
Got to go back to that stigma. Eventually, Steven Crowder's got a shirt of Che Guevara that says "Socialism is for fags." I don't love the language, but I like the fact that people need to associate it with bad behavior. So hopefully we'll see that happen during my generation. You wrote about a Supreme Court case in your book that I was unfamiliar with. It was 1824. It was Gibbons versus Ogden. Tell us why that matters for those who haven't heard of it.
Well, I think you're referring to the New York monopoly on
correct, on the steamboats.
On steamboats. Yeah, well, I distinguish between market entrepreneurs, people who make money and sometimes get rich by providing a valued service to their customers. If you ever watch the television show Shark Tank, the people who go on there and succeed, they're market entrepreneurs. They figure out a way to please their fellow man, and they make money doing it. What's wrong with that? But then there are political entrepreneurs, people who make money through political connections, by having a law passed that keeps out the competition or imposes heavy costs on the competition, but not you. And Robert Fulton, school children used to be taught that he invented the steamship or something along those lines. Well, he had a monopoly on the Hudson River of traffic between Connecticut and New York and the Hudson River.
Nice.
And Cornelius Vanderbilt, a young Cornelius Vanderbilt, challenged that by running a boat for. He was working for a wealthy businessman, and he offered free transportation, and they made their money by selling food and drinks on the boats. And he eventually forced Robert Fulton into bankruptcy, because how can you compete with free? And so that eventually was litigated. But that's the economic impact of the story. That an early example of market competition, market entrepreneurship winning out over what has always existed to some degree, political entrepreneurship, which is the bad kind. And that's why, a lot of the Bernie Sanders supporters, some of the same young people were Ron Paul supporters when Ron Paul was running for the Republican nomination, because they opposed the bailouts of the big banks and crony capitalism. And then Ron Paul retires, and a lot of the same young people become Bernie Sanders supporters, because he also rants and raves against crony capitalism. But of course, the big difference is Ron Paul saw the solution to that as the free market competition. Bernie Sanders sees his solution as the opposite, socialism, which always means more government monopoly, more government corruption in society. And so these young people need to be educated that they've gone down the wrong path if they're really concerned about crony capitalism.
Absolutely. And the 1824 case, I mean, we hear a lot today about Uber and how they restrict it in some areas, and there were ride-sharing companies using quote-unquote bus routes, and the cities will shut them down. And I thought, this battle has been fought over and over and over again, not just in our generation, but for centuries, this ideological
battle.
It is.
Yeah, it certainly has. There's a long, long history of it. There's a nonprofit legal institute called the Institute for Justice that's been around for 25 or 30 years, and the lawyers who work there, I know a few of them. I was actually one of the original donors. I sent them $100 check when I was a much younger assistant professor at George Mason 100 years ago.
Excellent.
And I think their first financial statement had something like $3 million from Charles Koch and then $100 from me, because I personally knew Chip Mellor, the first president of the Institute for Justice. But they have been litigating things like this, economic liberty cases, they call it, cases where people are deprived of job as a taxi driver or a jitney driver or something, or an Uber driver, because of some old law protecting the local bus company or somebody else like that.
Taxi medallions, right? Those $100 medallions.
Right.
Yeah, so
exactly.
If I go to Institute for Justice and go to the founders' homepage, are the Koch brothers on one side and you, Dr. DiLorenzo, on the other?
I think they've probably eliminated that. That was a law. It was 30 years ago, I think.
Well, still, you were there at the beginning. So anyone who's listening to this, it's going to live on forever on YouTube. Go spend $10 and buy the book on Kindle or in hardcover or soft cover. Definitely worth the money. One thing I'm encouraged about in the reviews is it's a lot of parents saying, my son went to the dark side. He's voting for Bernie. My daughter is confused. I gave him this book, and they started asking some of the right questions. And I think it's an easy read in terms of, wow, all these countries were destroyed. Wow, all these people did really horrible things, but they believe the same thing that I believe in and that my college professors believe in. So it's a must read. I think before we go, I didn't realize this until I started doing some research on you, that you've been very critical of Abraham Lincoln. You've written a book about it. You've been outspoken about the South's right to secede. And you remind me of another guest I had on recently, Brian McClanahan, who wrote 9 Presidents Who Screwed Up America. He said some of the same things to me. I'm fascinated by the topic. Can we spend just a few minutes talking about why that's relevant in the day when California and Texas are both talking about seceding, and you actually, I feel like you kind of have a movement that's gaining some steam.
There was a debate over this in conservative circles in the 50s and 60s. Frank Meyer, another member of the old right that I mentioned earlier, wrote quite a few articles in National Review and elsewhere for a few years anyway, and in some of his other writings on this, on Lincoln, and was critical of Lincoln, and not because he was associated with ending slavery, but and what I write also is one of the consequences of the Civil War. You don't have to if you study the Civil War, it's not like a football game where either you're for the home team or you're for the other team. History is history. You want to learn what happened. Right. And so one of the consequences of the Civil War, as with all wars, is a great centralization of power in Washington, D.C., by eliminating the right of nullification, essentially the right of secession, certainly. And a lot of the American founders, especially Thomas Jefferson, thought that, if we're going to delegate these powers to the central government, there has to be some mechanism that's in the hands of the people to enforce this Constitution and to enforce the delegation of powers, or else the government will take all the powers, the federal government. And so that's why Jefferson himself, even in the 1820s, shortly before his death, was still writing letters predicting that the United States would probably be broken up into several different confederacies. And he said, I could paraphrase him, he said, we would wish them all well because they will all be our children, politically speaking. And so he saw that as happening, and he thought it would be a good thing because he thought the decentralization of power was essential to freedom. That's why Jefferson is known as the author of the Kentucky Resolve of 1798, which nullified the Sedition Act in the state of Kentucky. Anyway, his friends in Kentucky asked him to write this. Madison wrote the similar thing for Virginia, the Virginia Resolve of 1798. So the American tradition in politics is federalism. And federalism means decentralized government. And so, and you don't have to be necessarily calling yourself a Lincoln critic to understand that one of the consequences of the Civil War was a bad consequence, was the consolidation of power at the top in Washington, D.C. And that doesn't mean we can never again move away from that. The advocates of that have always invoked the image of Lincoln, who has been, a secular saint, to oppose decentralization. They always do it. And they'll call you names, they'll call you a slavery defender and things like that. But, and the same, I'm sure Brian McClanahan has been called a slavery defender for advocating decentralized government.
Oh, sure. I call them that. Of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is that your lead critique for Abraham? What other pertinent critiques are there that I think that don't get enough attention in your book?
That's my book, The Real Lincoln, is where it is. And my other book is called Lincoln Unmasked. And I gave a talk at I give a lot of talks on this. And some of the times I do refer to, like I said, the Frank Myers of the world, where this was a live debate among conservatives, basically until the Frank Myers of the world were sort of written out of the movement, because during the Cold War, William F. Buckley, who was very prominent, advocated a big, highly centralized government with a big spying apparatus, the CIA, and everything, to win the Cold War. And so these old conservatives, the old right, like Frank Meyer and others, were sort of swept under the rug because they weren't seen as being consistent with the centralized state that the other conservatives thought was necessary to defeat communism.
Yeah, today we call that being down with the cause or not black enough. I don't know if that would apply to Buckley, but I hear that sometimes on the news from some of the race hustlers. Doctor, it's been a real pleasure and a treat. I'm curious what you're working on now. Are you working on a new book, or are you just taking a little break? What are you crusading
I'm always
for
working
at the
on
moment?
something. I have one book on the political economy of war, because I've been teaching a course under that name for several years. And so I've decided to write a book on. There's a lot of literature that economists like me know about the causes and consequences of war, but it's mostly very obtuse and academic. And so I'm trying to write a book that is understandable to the educated layperson on war. And I'm also working on a book on Henry Clay. I wrote a book called Hamilton's Curse, which when I was on the Morning Joe TV program, they sat me down next to Patrick J. Buchanan,
Good times.
who told me Hamilton was his hero. And so we're going into a big argument there. But I'm a critic of Hamilton also, and so Clay was Hamilton's political heir. So I'm writing a book that's critical of Henry Clay also, mostly because he was one of the founding fathers of crony capitalism in America. It was called the American system, but it was really the British system of mercantilism brought to America And so that's another thing I'm working on right now.
Well, I hope when it releases, you'll allow this uneducated layperson to share it with, by then, a larger audience, and we'll get the word out. I didn't realize. I'm curious how much Clay was mentored by Hamilton. I haven't heard that talked about much.
Well, Clay, the Whig Party took up the mantle of the Federalist Party as far as economics is concerned after the Federalist Party disappeared and the Whig Party appeared in the 1830s. And they were in favor of high protectionist tariffs, a bank run by politicians out of Washington, D.C., a national bank, and what we today call corporate welfare. They called it internal improvement subsidies in those days. And that didn't really all come into being until the Lincoln administration, when we got all of that. And so I see a direct line between Hamilton, Clay, and Lincoln, who are economic nationalists. And so when President Trump uses the same language, and he actually has quoted Henry Clay in some of his speeches, and I'm not saying everything Henry Clay said about economics is a bad idea, but most of it was. And so that's why I think this book would be relative to today, with President Trump touting economic nationalism.
Internal improvement subsidies. That's kind of like carbon credits. I could use a few of those. I'm going to look into that. Doctor, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much. I'll make sure I encourage everyone to get your book. I hope anyone watching this will spend it's only a few bucks online. I mean, it's really nothing compared to what you're going to get in return, and I wish you well going forward.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me on. Take care.
This is hilarious. If you're uneducated, please at least don't make it obvious.